Dr. Eva Burke, welcome back to Head on Fire. It's so good to see you again.
I'm so happy to be back.
I am so okay. I am personally glad to have you back. I'm not happy about the circumstances under which
Mhm.
you are back, but during your last appearance here on the show, we did talk about the fact that you do teach horror and genre fiction. And
Mhm.
I did express that I am a baby when it comes to
Mhm.
horror and I don't like it. And so you promised me that you could possibly get me to come around or at least come back on the show and kind of
Mhm.
discuss horrors. That's what we're here to do today. It is spooky season. It's
Yes.
October when we're talking. It's the perfect time to talk about horror.
Mhm.
So I just want to dive right in because at this point, I normally would say, oh, for folks who don't know who you are, but if they don't know who you are, they can just go back and listen to the other episode.
Yeah, they can figure it out.
They can figure it out. So you teach horror films and genre fiction. And for anybody that
Mhm.
isn't watching the YouTube version of this, I'm putting air quotes around genre fiction,
Mhm.
which is ostensibly teaching students how to critically engage with this format, this genre,
Mhm.
this literary canon. I have a couple of questions for you. One, I have tried to figure out a definition for genre fiction or genre
Mhm.
film or genre whatever, and I cannot find a unifying definition anywhere on the internet. Some people say that it's like a B movie, it's a bad movie, or it's a this or that.
Mhm.
And then there's other people that say, oh, it's anything that falls into horror, thriller, suspense, etc. But all of those have names. So how do you define genre fiction?
I think it often is used pejoratively as an insult, or kind of the implication is that it's not literary, or it's not arty, or it's not kind of culturally good for us. Um, I tend to prefer the term popular fiction. Um, And this makes it a bit trickier because sometimes people will say, okay, Pride and Prejudice has sold a lot of copies. It's very popular. Does that mean it's popular fiction? And I would say no. I use the term popular fiction to refer to kind of mass market fiction or cultural output that is targeted at a very wide base of people, if that makes sense. Um, Generally, it is marketed in ways that are very recognizable to you. So if you walk into a bookstore or if you go on Amazon, if a rom-com like comes up on your page, or a crime novel comes up, there are kind of signifiers that will make you aware of what it is quite quickly. Um, and horror is one of the better ones for this because the marketing material and the visual content and the what we call paratext. So everything kind of surrounding the text, like the blurbs. There might be a blurb by Stephen King. Um, it's recognizably a, a, a piece of that genre. It belongs to that genre. In a way that something like maybe Sally Rooney's work maybe doesn't, if that makes sense. The marketing and the paratext is kind of less explicitly genred in that sense.
Can I ask for a few more definitions? So
Mhm.
there are a few genres that kind of intermingle, overlap, sometimes
Yes.
get confused for one another.
Mhm.
Horror, thriller,
Mhm.
suspense. I'm sure there's a few others. Maybe you can help me fill in some blanks here.
Yeah.
Could you help me
Um,
define what each of those are, how they're different from one another,
mhm.
what they are supposed like what each of those is supposed to mean?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of kind of cross-pollination that confuses things, like paranormal romance, for example,
Mm.
is a semi-recent example that kind of confuses definition. And it is very hard to draw parameters or to draw boundaries and say this is definitely a horror novel. Someone might say Twilight is definitely a romance novel, but that doesn't exclude it from being also kind of gothic and paranormal. Um, I would
Gothic is
say,
another one
well,
that
yeah,
gets
and
thrown in there.
I think of the Gothic as kind of the grandfather of horror.
Mm.
So I teach earlier Gothic, like things like Frankenstein, Carmilla. And then coming into the kind of 18th century, things like The Monk by Matthew Lewis, I think that would be explicitly almost a horror novel rather than a gothic novel. It's kind of a fine distinction, but the gothic and horror, I think, is an example of what you're talking about. Um, I mean, the other example I go to is like a detective novel versus a thriller. I think you might have an idea of the distinction there. A detective novel or a procedural, for example, like a crime procedural, usually has a professional detective of some kind, or a police figure, or some kind of figure of authority, who's carrying out an investigation from a position of authority. Whereas a thriller, especially the kind of domestic thriller, which I'm very interested in, they tend to be kind of civilian protagonists or
Mm.
people who are very much enmeshed in the crime, like they're being victimized themselves, you
Does
know?
that mean that the late Angela Lansbury was in a thriller
Oh,
in Murder, She Wrote?
she belongs to a tradition of kind of amateur lady detectives, which is a very interesting tradition. Um, I think we could make the case that she was in a very mild kind of cozy thriller.
A
I yeah
cozy
I would,
thriller. Oh, I love that. Oh, I would like
yeah.
to read a cozy thriller.
Yeah, there is a whole subgenre called like cozy crime that's there are murders, but they're quite sanitized and they're not very gory or violent, and sexual violence doesn't usually exist. And a lot of people like that because it's
There's murders, but there's also a lot of doilies.
yes,
It's very
there's
sweet.
like cats solving murders and like librarians
I'm
solving
sorry,
murders.
did you say cat solving murders?
Yeah, yeah,
I
this
would
is the whole
I
subgenre.
I would like
Yeah.
to read about a cat solving a murder.
I used to think it was ridiculous, and then the pandemic happened, and I was like, I get this. I completely understand the desire to have like a bit of excitement, but it's contained in a little English village, and nobody's really in
So
danger.
I know I'm reading a thriller when there's typically somebody solving something, and a
Mm,
thriller is usually not a person of authority,
mm,
governmental authority. It's not a
yeah,
detective. It's not a person from the government. It's a
mm.
civilian protagonist. Is that I'm reading a thriller then?
Yeah, that would be the distinction I make between like a detective or a procedural and a thriller.
Mhm.
Um,
So
and
how
there
do I know
are,
I'm reading suspense?
oh gosh, I mean, that's such a broad question. I mean, how do you define suspense? Like, do you mean the effect? Like, do you feel suspense when you're reading it? Is that what you mean?
Oh, I don't. It's a category. There's thriller,
Yeah.
suspense, horror, and they all.
Hmm.
But I have struggled to figure out exactly what
Yeah.
each of those words mean because usually when it's somebody says, "Oh, it's a
Hmm.
suspense movie, it's a suspense novel, it's a
Or a
suspense this."
suspense thriller. I have heard suspense
I've
thriller.
heard of that too, and
Yeah.
I don't know what makes something suspense
Hmm.
versus a thriller versus
I
explicitly
think
horror.
a lot of them are marketing terms that are kind of arbitrarily applied.
Gotcha.
Um, but I think it is very hard to draw kind of distinctions. For me, something that is suspenseful or like a suspense novel, um, often it involves kind of the uncovering of secrets,
Mm.
intimate secrets, family secrets, maybe. Maybe it's less explicitly violent um, than, let's say, a crime thriller. Um, yeah, it is quite hard to define. I do think there has been a move inward in the past kind of 20 years um, with the thriller. So we're really in people's homes now, and I'm sure you're aware there are
Do
so
not
many
like.
kind of domestic thrillers. Yeah, and
Do not
it
like. Nope. I will tell
really.
you we haven't started talking about movies yet, but I will tell you a movie that I started because sometimes, when a lot of people are talking about a movie, when it's everywhere, when it's, and I don't think it's going to be explicitly a slasher or even if it is a slasher. I don't know. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, I can see some blood and guts today.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw The Strangers, which is
Oh yeah.
allegedly based on a true story, and I mean, I had to work myself up to it, and I had to stop that movie about
Mm-hmm.
30 minutes in, and for anybody that's ever seen that movie, they will know the point at which I stopped because
Yeah.
it's the first time that you see that the guy is in the house, and
Yeah.
Liv Tyler doesn't know that he's in the house, and I was like, nope, That's noped right on out of that one.
I think I'm not a fan of that film,
Nope.
for several reasons, but I think the first half of it is kind of masterful in how it builds suspense, and I have used that scene as an example for students in building suspense. But I'm not a fan of the film because um for me that's the worst example of a slasher, in that the characters are so stupid and they make such poor decisions that my sympathy just wanes, because I can't buy
Well,
into
that's me with almost every slasher. I promise the audience we will get there. We have a whole list of movies that
it.
we want to get through and stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, any I my problem with slashers tends to be everyone is very stupid. Um
Yes.
so
um
but I do want to go back to the idea of critical analysis.
mhm.
So instead of just trying to define these, you also teach how to critically engage with these types of stories. What does critical analysis of this type of genre fiction look like, and how does it differ from critically engaging with something that's maybe more universally found in a literature course or in a film studies
Yeah.
course, something like a Shakespeare or your
Mm-hmm.
unit on poetry or Chaucer or something like that? Like how does critical analysis of this genre differ from something that you might find in a normal classroom?
I think we begin with a kind of an understanding as a class and as a group that often this is fiction that is devalued for a number of reasons, like culturally devalued. It's not part of the canon. Like it's not Shakespeare, it's not Jane Austen, it's not Seamus Heaney. Um, and I think we might start by asking ourselves, like, what goes into the canon? Why is this not part of the canon? What's different between this and canonical fiction? Are there reasons, like, are there gendered reasons? Like I find when I teach romance fiction and chick lit, students are still far less likely to take that seriously as academic material, in contrast to something like fantasy or sci-fi, which these days I find, if you're reading something like The Lord of the Rings or um, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, they seem much more inclined to sort of accept that as like worthy of academic focus or attention. Um, but other, I think, more explicitly gendered forms still seem to kind of attract a lot of questions about quality and content. And that's something I think that's a big part of what I do, and a big part of popular literature studies in general. Um, Questioning what it is, like what underlying assumptions do we have about things like value? Um, what makes a good book? What makes something worth reading? Um, is plot more important than the use of language? Can we look at something like Gone Girl or Bridget Jones's Diary? Can we find literary merit in there? Um, because I think we all come to this particular subject with a lot of preconceptions and a lot of baggage. Because, I mean, right up until you get to college, when you're in school, you are taught like Shakespeare is what's worth studying. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is worth studying. We don't study The Hobbit generally. We don't study Gone Girl. We don't study a lot of crime fiction at that level. So I think we come to it with a lot of preconceptions, and breaking down those preconceptions is part of it. Um, Looking for value, and even just interrogating what we think value is, what it means. Um, and also, I really like to think about whether escapism is a bad thing, because I find a lot of the criticism of popular fiction and popular culture more kind of broadly is, oh, it's very escapist, and people just want to watch this and sort of um, forget the real world. And I think there's huge value in escapism, and it makes me very sad that we don't really think that there is, or that people feel like they should be shamed, or um, that they shouldn't talk about reading something for escapist reasons. Like it's enough to read something because you enjoy it. You don't necessarily need to feel shame and like guilt or hide what you're reading because you think other people won't approve of it. I remember when the Twilight like phenomenon was happening. And I remember jumping on the hate train for Twilight because I was like a teenager, an older teenager at the time, and I was like, yeah, this is a really bad book. And I'm not saying that Twilight is necessarily like well written or a good book, but so much of that, looking back now, was just about shaming people for enjoying something that we didn't think deserved to be enjoyed, if that makes sense.
It's interesting that you bring that example up because I find it interesting
Mm-hmm.
how people reacted when those books were popular to the idea that Stephanie Meyer was a good writer. I distinctly remember a Stephen King quote where, well, okay, I distinctly remember Stephen King commenting on this. I'm not exactly sure of the exact quote, but it was
Mm-hmm.
something like they compared Meyer with Rowling,
Mm-hmm.
and he was doing so very disparagingly. He
Yeah.
basically said Stephanie Meyer couldn't write her way out of a paper bag, and J.K. Rowling, oh my gosh, she builds these worlds and this and that and the other, and all of the critical um, sort of obsession with
Mm-hmm.
Rowling and how Meyer was just raked over the coals as this terrible,
Yeah.
unoriginal, uninspired writer who lucked into the right book at the right time. And lucking
Yeah.
into the right book at the right time is a whole different discussion. But
Mm-hmm.
I bring that up to say I find it interesting now, the revised critique of
Mm-hmm.
Rowling's work now,
Yes.
and how we are looking back at it and are
Mm-hmm.
willing to pick it apart
Yes.
because now
Because
she
now
has fallen
you
out of
have,
favor.
yeah, you have free reign because I
Yes.
mean, I think,
And oh, the racism was there all along, the homophobia was there all
yeah.
along, the transphobia was there all along. And I bring all of this up to say it's so interesting how we all felt we had permission to do that with Meyer in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning, and we waited until Rowling exposed herself as a TERF and transphobe and all of that,
Yes.
and then we went back and picked it apart. And I think there's a
Yeah.
conversation there about how we judge certain genres and certain works based
Mm-hmm.
on the preconception of you're either writing for an audience that consumes silly things. So
Mm-hmm.
Meyer wrote for young women,
Teenage girls,
and
yeah, of
culture culture hates anything that's for young women. It just
course.
does.
Yeah.
Um, whereas Rowling was writing about this young magical boy who was super super special, and we love to tell young boys
We
that
can
they're
all
super
relate.
super special.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think you've picked out a few things here that are really important, which is firstly, I think the author has personality,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea that what we think of the author has anything to do with what we think of the work, which is a very big question. Obviously, I don't agree with J.K. Rowling's views on anything anymore. I had been a huge fan as a child, obviously, as many
Sure.
of us
Who
were.
was I was 11 when that first book came out. I was
Yeah,
11, Harry
same. I
Potter was
was the same
11.
age.
I mean,
Yeah,
it was
we
formative.
aged up. Yeah, we
Yeah.
aged up at the same time.
Yeah, it
Um,
was
I'm
formative.
I'm not a fan of because it happened with Joss Whedon as well and Buffy. I'm not a
Mhm.
fan of when somebody is exposed as a terrible person. I'm not a fan of going back and saying, "Oh, well, I always hated their work" or "It was always bad." I find that so toxic and
Yes.
so performative and
Yes.
unnecessary. Bad people can make good art, and it's childish to pretend otherwise. Um,
Yeah, this whole we hated
especially
them the whole time revised
yeah,
narrative.
it's
No,
not.
we didn't. No, we
It's okay
didn't.
to admit that you liked it.
Yes.
I'm not saying Harry Potter is fine art or that it's very well written or anything, but it's okay to say I really enjoyed it as a child. And some people still find comfort in reading it,
Yes.
reading old books or whatever. Um, but also I think Stephanie Meyer was kind of she was never really going to succeed with a certain group of people because she was openly a Mormon housewife who talked about how the idea for the book came to her in a very romantic dream.
Hmm.
And that was kind of catnip for people who already weren't willing to take someone like her seriously. Um, and I think there's a huge aspect of that that's incredibly gendered and the same thing happened years later with E.L. James, who wrote 50 Shades of Grey, which obviously was based on Twilight. Um, and again, I'm not saying that the content of the books is necessarily good or that the books are good or whatever, but it was really kind of derisory. Like, she's a housewife. What would she know about writing? Or um, kind of implicit critiques of like older women's sexuality, that these women were like sitting at home lonely and kind of fantasizing and like you turning their fantasies into mass market fiction. And I find that really, really troubling. Because it's a critique of who's writing it, it's a critique of who's reading it. The understanding that, okay, this is for like desperate housewives or like women in like sexless marriages who just want to get off and read like 50 Shades of Grey. I find that really, really problematic. It just says a lot, I think, about um, who we think consumes romance fiction in particular, and how we still contain a lot of those, or we still put forward a lot of those really regressive ideas about who's reading it. Like the romance genre is, in 2022, there are so many like queer stories, there are so many different versions of kind of love stories and stories of sexuality that it makes me really sad that people are still very kind of regressive or have this kind of stereotype in mind. But I do think that's what Stephanie Meyer fell afoul of. Being a conservative religious woman. I'm not saying I agree with her religion or her conservative beliefs or whatever, but
But
she
all
was
of those
never.
things gave us permission to
Yes,
find fault with her much earlier.
yeah, from the outset almost. But I do think it's funny that in the intervening years, Stephanie Meyer has just gone away and kept her money and just been happy. And now J.K. Rowling is this
Or
just.
did she? Or did she? There's all of that. Oh,
She's
she's
still
writing under a
writing.
pseudonym these
I've
days.
heard that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by her. I think that I will still argue. I think there was the kernel of a good story in Twilight. And some of her other fiction is not terrible. So yeah.
I don't think that it would have sold the number of copies that it did. Having the right book at the right time,
Hmm.
having the luck of the algorithm, all of those kinds of things, SEO, search engine optimization, all of those things can help. But
Hmm.
if there's nothing in the story, it's not. I
Yes,
mean,
I
I
agree. I
I
think
read 50 Shades. There was at least something enjoyable. I mean, it was at least an
yeah,
entertainment factor to them.
yeah, it was mildly compelling. I mean, I read the first two books. I didn't finish
Sure,
the series. But yeah, I kept reading it. I wouldn't have finished if there wasn't
sure.
like something in there. So
So
yeah.
let's talk about the way that critics engage. I want to bring it back to horror. Critics famously hate horror, hate
Hmm.
genre stories generally speaking, and they are almost always excluded from major awards.
Yeah.
It's up for debate whether or not an exception was made in 2019 when Parasite swept all
Hmm.
of the awards. I'm not sure if that's horror or thriller or suspense or a genre, or if that was something else, something so new and so unique that it was able to defy genre. But suffice to say, why do you think that critics, people who are paid to critically engage with material, have such a universal distaste for horror genre stories, generally speaking? And do you think that that influences mass consumption?
I think that horror is very much perceived as trashy, like a guilty pleasure, which is a term that I hate. Something that you can watch and laugh at or enjoy, but it's not to be taken seriously. Um, I'm not sure. I wonder if it comes from like the kind of B movies of the 1930s, like Frankenstein, and the Dracula movies, and the idea that this kind of spectacle wasn't really to be taken seriously. I also think horror makes a lot of people uncomfortable in a way that we don't really like to acknowledge. Even if you're not a fan of horror, um, you may have this kind of really deep rooted um, feeling that it really unsettles a part of you that you don't like thinking about. Um, and I wonder if that's one of the reasons, like one of the deeper reasons why culturally we don't value horror as much as I think we should. But also, I think horror and the Gothic more generally, I think its function is to um, there's a brilliant quote from a lecturer called Jarlath Colleen. He says that it kind of transmogrifies our real life anxieties, and it gives them back to us to kind of think about in ways that are not explicit. So, something like Hereditary, which I know you hate, we might look at as something about loss and grief. That it allows us to explore cultural or personal anxieties in ways that for whatever reason we're kind of afraid to confront directly. um, that might be one of the reasons. It's painted with the genre brush, and often that will mean that it's put in the B movie bucket and that it's not seen as art. There's a huge In the past kind of 5-6 years, there's been this huge thing of like elevated horror. People like Ari Aster and Jordan Peele who make
A24. Yeah.
yeah, who make horror movies for the kind of people you were talking about. And I really hate the idea that this is a thing. I think horror is horror, and if you think it needs to be elevated, then you're not really a fan of horror. Um, I don't think that the genre needs to be elevated in any sense. I think that it's always been as good as the stuff Jordan Peele is putting out, and it's just that we are, for whatever reason, we need it to be dressed up in the kind of respectability of A24 and things like that to kind of be seen to take it seriously, which really bothers me. Um, in terms of Parasite, I think Parasite is kind of a genre bending one. It goes from like a kind of comedic film to a sort of domestic thriller, and then there are aspects of horror, and then it's a family drama. And I think that was kind of an anomaly, though. I don't see a horror movie um, breaking into kind of like award circuits. If it didn't happen for The Witch, and if it didn't happen for Hereditary, which again I know you didn't like, and I know it was very divisive, but I still think Toni Collette deserved more recognition for her performance in that film.
I think Toni Collette deserves more recognition, generally speaking.
General, in
I
general.
just, I just wish it would be for a different movie than that. But I do, but I recognize as an actor and as a
Mhm.
performance, she had to go to some places
Oh,
that were certainly other people have taken home little golden statues for less than she gave in
yeah.
that movie. I will concede that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Um, but I think if she didn't win, if those films didn't win, I don't know. I like The Lighthouse hasn't really. Um,
Midsummer
yeah,
didn't win anything.
Midsummer. I don't know. I don't see it
No, I
happening.
didn't. I
Um,
didn't. I mean, I watched it and I was like, "Oh,
mhm.
that's interesting. It could have been 45 minutes shorter." But, that's
Yeah.
me. That's pacing issues. Um I want to talk because you've mentioned the word gendered several times, and it made me think of a
Mhm.
conversation that I had with Joshua Conkle, screenwriter behind Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and he's got some movies. I think he's sitting in the director's chair next, so that's pretty cool.
Mhm.
And he's done a lot of TV work, but specifically deals in the spaces of horror and uh, uh, that kind of thing. And I think has a podcast now where he goes back through and sort of does a critical rewatch of various horror movies. Anyways, it made me think of conversations with him where he talked about the fact that horror has always been a place for underserved minorities to sort of
Mhm.
express anxiety, fear, to examine fear, to put the fear on the screen as not the thing in the background, but as the story itself, not as
Mhm.
subtext, but as text, and to examine it and to work through it and to sometimes be the hero.
Yeah.
Um, why do you think women, minorities, queer folks uh, engage with horror specifically? And it was interesting how this dovetails into, so you gave me a list of films
Yes.
to watch, and
Mhm.
I was remembering that conversation with Joshua while I was watching the first one, which was Black Christmas.
Yes.
And I thought this story couldn't have
Mhm.
been told in another genre. the
Yeah.
the
I
main story,
agree.
what's her name, Jess, the
Yes.
main
Yes.
the main character, her
Mhm.
story is an abortion story. Her story is a
Mhm.
story about a woman wanting to retain autonomy over her life, to not be
Mhm.
told by her college boyfriend that they have to get married
Get
and she has
married.
to have a
Yeah.
child. I mean, it was practically a feminist manifesto. I mean, it was
Yeah.
a brilliant story, and it could not have been told in another genre.
No, I agree. I think one of the reasons that horror resonates with marginalized groups of people is because it gives us permission and space, and almost maybe that kind of critical neglect that you've talked about gives us kind of further permission um, in thinking that maybe people aren't really paying attention culturally, so it's
Mm.
okay. We get away with exploring things like abortion, exploring things like kind of bodily autonomy. Um, there is a critic from the 1970s called Ellen Mears who coined the term female gothic, and she talked about how the gothic traditionally, and horror as well, I think, has been a space for women to explore fears of like entrapment, bodily entrapment, like literal entrapment in some cases, fears of bodily destruction as well. It's one
The
of the reasons.
movie Mother comes to mind with
Yes, Darren Aronofsky, Jennifer Lawrence.
Jennifer Lawrence.
Yes, and that's one I think that straddles the line we've talked about between being horror and being like acceptable cinema.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I think though Black Christmas is a fantastic example, and one of the reasons it's one of my favorite movies. It's my favorite Christmas movie. I just think it's phenomenal. Is that it's so
I
festive.
watched it with my husband. My husband loves Christmas. My husband loves horror movies, loves to be scared, loves them. And he is very excited to have a new movie to add to his watch
Oh,
list.
the Christmas movie list.
Mm,
Yes.
yeah.
No, it's. I know that the director made a film called A Christmas Story, which is not really a thing here in Ireland. It's not that well known, but
Wait, is
apparently in
that the
America,
same director? What?
yeah, apparently he made this film called A Christmas Story, which is a big thing in America.
This film.
Um,
Wait, wait,
yeah,
wait, wait. I'm sorry. I need to. I'm. No.
yeah. I know.
No.
I know that it's a big Christmas film in the States. It's not a thing here, but yeah,
It's because it's so specifically American, and
yeah,
the only reason why it would be anything is because we were like force fed this movie. Like it was on like cable reruns. It started off. It's so that's crazy because that
yeah,
at least two of
yeah,
his movies then, because Black Christmas was critically destroyed when it came
yeah.
out.
At
It
the
was a
time, yeah.
giant flop, and it's gone on to be re-examined as I was reading up on it, the first slasher movie. It inspired
Yeah,
Halloween. It is
masterpiece.
now, yeah, it's now a masterpiece.
Yeah,
And it's so interesting how he did that twice in his
I
life,
know,
accidentally made a
I
masterpiece that
know.
was not appreciated in its time.
But I think it just goes to show how we,
That's crazy. That's
the way
crazy.
that we devalue popular art and popular fiction can kind of change over time, and like maybe we'll look back. I wonder what we'll look back at in 30 years and think, oh, that was actually a gem. Maybe Don't Worry, Darling, or whatever. Probably not Don't Worry, Darling.
Well, do you think maybe that films, even films that are much more niche or films that
Mm,
require a specific point of view or a specific sense of humor or even specific references, that they are able to be appreciated, if not immediately, at least much more quickly after their release because of
mm,
streaming, because of accessibility, because people that might be
yeah,
in that audience can find that movie and
yeah.
celebrate that movie
I think,
sooner.
yeah, I think it's more likely now because there's so much more accessibility
Hmm.
compared to the 1970s, when maybe the audience just wasn't there for this. But I love that it's remembered as the masterpiece that it is. I think it's um, almost exactly what Ellen Mears talked about when she talked about female gothic, and it's a house full of women whose fears aren't being taken seriously by the authorities.
Hmm.
Um, they're having these like sexual threats thrown at them. There's this abortion subplot that I just think is really wonderful and ahead of its time, and just yeah,
Well, but Barb liked to
yeah,
drink. Barb liked
yeah,
men. I mean, all of these people were, all of these women were just,
yeah.
I get to be myself, and there are no men in the house to tell me I can't.
And the disapproving father is like played for laughs, like
Yeah.
he's the stick in the mud. I love that he's not validated in his
Uh-huh.
nonsense. I love the house mother, that she's just this cat lady who is just perpetually drunk.
Yeah,
No, it's so ahead of its time.
very ahead of its time.
Yeah, when I first saw it about 10 years ago, and I just didn't know what to expect because I think I'd seen one of the remakes. The remakes are quite bad.
Yeah,
Um,
can I tell you why I think so?
yes.
Because they gave the murderer a backstory. In all of the other
Yeah.
remakes, they gave him a reason.
Hmm.
And
I think so. No, go ahead.
I think from the if this is the mother of slashers,
Hmm.
as some articles that I read about this when I was doing the
Hmm.
research for this, this is sort of, retroactively revisionist, the mother of slashers, the film
Hmm.
that inspired Halloween, et cetera, et cetera. So if that's true, then the slashers, going back in my mind and thinking of any films that I have liked from that genre,
Hmm.
the 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 slasher themselves, the killer themselves, did not have a backstory. We did not need to know much
Yeah.
more about him. If they had a name, great. There's there's a queer horror movie called Hellbent that this movie reminds me of
Hmm.
so much. And the great thing about that is that the killer is just evil
Hmm.
lurking in the shadows, ready to kill you. Why?
Hmm.
Don't know, does not matter. All you need to know is that everybody in the movie is about to die. And honestly, it gave the rest of the, I mean, I wasn't sitting there trying to figure out motivation or trying to get into the
Hmm.
psyche of the killer. And I think that there are some movies that can do that very well. But I think for what a slasher is, which is, there's a terror in the night and you might
Yeah,
be next.
that's all it needs to be, I think.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I think we've become obsessed with backstories though in the more recent horror films. Like I know Rob Zombie, he remade some of the Halloween films, and famously he gives Michael Myers like a sad childhood backstory. Like his mom was a stripper, and there are huge red flags there about kind of like
Oh
slut
yeah.
shaming and but she doesn't take him trick or treating, and he has a kind of a traumatic childhood, and we're kind of supposed to infer from that that this is why he became who he is. But I hate that. I much prefer the idea that he's just this presence. He's just
Mhm.
this kind of manifest evil that has doesn't like a shark. It doesn't have um it doesn't have a motivation. It doesn't have a traumatic backstory. It just wants to kill you. And that I think that's all a slasher movie really needs. We don't need maybe if you're making a movie about like the Zodiac killer or like a genuine crime, then we can go into things like motivation and
Sure.
nuance.
I watched Blackbird earlier this year,
Oh yes.
with Taron Egerton and a guy from Cobra Kai as the killer.
Oh,
But
oh
that was a sort of a phenomenal
God.
psychological thriller. I mean, you're
Mhm.
unfolding the layers of this killer,
Yeah.
and that was incredible. But the point of the movie is psychology of this killer. But in the
Mhm.
slasher, the point of the movie is the terror that hides in the night,
Yes,
not.
because they're an object of terror. They're an agent of
Yes.
chaos. We don't need to think of them as a human with a history or
Hmm.
whatever. And I love that in Black Christmas we know he has a name. Probably his name is probably Billy. Um, he has some kind of, I assume, mental illness
Sure.
or some kind of severe psychological problems, and he kills women, and that's really all we need to know. And he's lurking in the house, and I don't like that the later films kind of revise. I think they did it with Leatherface as well in some of the later Texas Chainsaw movies, which is I think a tragedy because we don't need to sympathize or understand or think of him as a nuanced human being. That just complicates the
Well, and it
horror, you
also,
know?
like you brought up earlier, it can very quickly become wildly problematic.
Hmm.
Disability advocates, mental health advocates
Yeah.
constantly point to the horror genre to say, if you have mental illness, if you have a disability, specifically if that disability is physical,
Yeah.
specifically
Yeah.
if the disability is deformative in some way,
Yeah.
um, immediately we are evil, we are the other,
Hmm.
we're the villain. We're killing
Yeah.
people because of our mental illness, because of our sad, tragic backstory, because of our environments, because of our bodies.
Hmm.
And it's horrifying, since we're using that word, It's horrifying to think of the ways that we, talking about giving ourselves permission to do things and thinking that it's okay because, whatever. The ways that we give ourselves permission to equate mental illness and disability, et cetera, with the potential for savage murder.
Mhm. No, I agree. I think it is incredibly problematic to construct a backstory for a character, um, a backstory that's kind of founded on like mental illness or family trauma, especially if it's a character like Leatherface or Michael Myers, who we know is not fundamentally redeemable. Like we've had 6 movies of them chopping people up, so where are we gonna like? There's nowhere our sympathy or understanding can really go. And the message seems to be that like those traumas or terrible things or physical disabilities just create monsters or they make you a bad person. And yeah, facial disfigurement is a huge one I've noticed in certain horror movies. Physical difference in general. People who are physically other um, unfortunately tend to be positioned as kind of dangerous or if not dangerous, then sort of like pathetic or um, I'm thinking of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Franklin, who is Sally's brother who uses a wheelchair. Um, he's this really angry character in the film, and he can't really participate in the things that the other characters are doing because he's a wheelchair user, and his frustration is very obvious. But I would love to have a broader conversation with anyone who's listening about this, about disability in horror and how.
Well, I'm
Um,
Hitchcock was very famous for leaning
mhm,
into mental illness
mhm.
as an excuse for violence, for
Yeah.
derangement. Psycho, namely.
Uh, but it does, I suppose it does, unfortunately, like validate this broader idea that mental illness is dangerous and
Mhm,
shameful and it shouldn't be talked about. And if you do have a mental illness, then you're a danger to people around you.
mhm.
I like that Black Christmas doesn't really specify um, what exactly is wrong with this person or what's really going on if he's just evil. And I do think it can be kind of stigmatizing to have a character whose sad backstory we see or we hear, okay, he has mother issues or his mother abused him or whatever. Um, because then we either have to accept that it's not really his fault that he did this, or we have to accept that people who go through these experiences might be violent. And neither of those things are correct, you know?
I kind of want to ask just very directly. I gave my thoughts on it earlier, but I want to ask you, the expert, what do you find is the cultural value, the cultural and social value in horror?
Mm-hmm. Um, I think that horror, for many reasons, allows us to think about things like death, and danger and violence, and specifically gendered violence, in ways that we don't really get to do with other genres. Um, Something like Black Christmas, as you've mentioned, it gives us space to think about even a topic like, these girls have been getting kind of harassing, obscene phone calls for we don't know how long, but for a while, enough that they're familiar with it happening. And there has obviously been no kind of intervention or police intervention to this point. And something like that, I think, as you said earlier, I'm not sure if that could have been explored in a different film or if there would have been space to explore that in a different film. So I think that one of the cultural values that horror kind of gives us, or one of the things that it allows us to do, is really look in the kind of warped reflection of these things, like gendered violence, like violence against certain minorities. As ridiculous as horror often is, um, I think it is often seen as very unrealistic and outlandish. Um, but I think that it's one of the best genres for really allowing us to engage with certain like social issues and as you said, in allowing us to think about kind of minority experiences in ways that maybe we wouldn't have before. Because generally, if you're watching a horror movie, especially if it's a slasher movie, you're being asked to relate to and to empathize with somebody who is being victimized, somebody who is being pursued and attacked. And you're putting yourself maybe in a position that you haven't been in before. So let's say you are like a heterosexual white man, middle class, and
Was not.
you're not.
I can't even begin to get my head in that headspace.
Try really hard. But I mean, not to generalize, but vulnerability or certain kinds of vulnerability might not be something that you are used to
Mhm.
experiencing. Um, there's a fantastic book by Carol Clover called Men, Women, and Chainsaws, and she talks about how she really wanted to get to the question or get to the answer of why slasher movies were popular, why slasher movies where women were victimized were popular, and she found that to some extent teenage boys and men, they were rooting for the girl. They wanted to see her live and succeed and fight back. So I think that horror can do that for us. It can give us the experience of vulnerability, a kind of safe vulnerability that maybe we haven't experienced before, that we're not experiencing with other genres, if that makes sense. Um, I would highly recommend Carol Clover's book. It's really really fantastic, um, just really fantastic, like deconstruction of the genre and slasher movies and gender in general. I recommend it to everyone. I think it's wonderful.
The horror film
Mhm.
has sort of had an evolution over the last
Mhm.
50 years or so. Um,
Mhm.
you gave me a list to sort of give me a kind of a redux on the evolution of the horror film. Um, and I've made valiant efforts to get through it. And
Mhm.
I
I
will
gave you
have
a
it
good
all
list. Yeah, it's a good
finished.
list.
It is a very good list.
Mhm.
I will the films on the list because I posted it on social media and
Mhm.
people who are very into horror were very impressed with this list.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
oh yeah, did you not see all the little quote tweets? I'm like, oh my god, this is the best list. Yes, this should be. If you want an intro to horror list, this should be your list. So yeah, a lot of love for this list.
Mhm.
So the list for anybody listening, if you are looking for like 7 nights of horror
Mhm.
leading up to Halloween, it starts with Black Christmas from 1974. Then the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I had seen because I'm from Texas, and I feel like
Mhm.
you're just not allowed to get out of Texas unless you've seen that movie. Somebody's like, "Oh, did you know?" And then they will tell you, "Oh, did you know it's based on a true story?" And then you go look up that true story and you realize,
Ugh.
is it?
Yeah,
Is
stuff
it?
that's based on a true story is always it's usually cobbled together from
Yeah.
different bits and pieces or yeah. So
Yeah, like The Exorcist is based on a true story, but it's
yeah.
based on the same true story that like a million other sort
Yeah.
of supernatural horror movies are based on. Anyways,
Mhm.
the third movie on the list was The Fly from 1986, which I was kind of excited to see. You don't,
Mhm.
sci-fi horror is an interesting kind of space. Alien famously kind of lives in that
Mhm.
space. It's a horror movie in space. Candyman from 1992, Audition from 1999. I will tell you, the horror aficionados were very impressed by the addition of that
It
movie on
is.
the list.
It's a wonderful film. I will say for anyone who is of a sensitive disposition, there is a scene towards the end that's famously harrowing. Um, but it's a wonderful, wonderful film. It's very, very good. That's all I'm gonna
Uh,
say.
the next movie is Lake Mungo from 2008, and then finally Suspiria from
Mhm.
2018. So up here at the top, Black Christmas.
Mhm.
I was very pleasantly surprised by how much I liked the movie, like genuinely liked the movie. And one of the things that
Mhm.
I really like about some of these earlier horror films is that they are 90 minutes.
Mhm. Yes.
It is a
I
tight
don't think
movie.
a horror movie doesn't really need to go beyond 90 minutes. I
Yeah,
don't think. I mean, I'll make exceptions for like Midsummer, but I know you
Suspiria is
won't.
2.5 hours long, my dear. Let me just,
No,
yeah, I tried to bang that one out this morning and I was like, oh my gosh, this is very long.
yeah, it's an immersive experience. I agree. I don't think horror necessarily needs to be. I think it's more effective when it's tighter and shorter,
Yeah.
with few exceptions. But yeah, I do like that it's an hour and a half, and that's all you need really.
I appreciated that.
Mhm.
Black Christmas, I really enjoyed it. We've talked about it a lot. I just want to say that I feel like if this were made today with the
Mhm.
same reverence for the original, like if you were basically just to remake it scene for scene, the
Mhm.
only tweak that I would make is that Jess and Barb end up together. Jess and Barb clearly
Oh,
had
yeah.
chemistry. Yeah, yeah.
I would, yeah, I would love that. I would also like to see Peter suffer more. I hate Peter so much.
So Peter is so interesting because it's interesting that you bring that up because I feel like the the character of Peter is where you really start seeing this
Mm-hmm.
idea that horror movies are a way for us to, I don't know if it's live out the fantasy of the
Mm-hmm.
horror or something, but to process the horror, I guess is what I'll say.
Mm-hmm.
To process our horror on screen because Peter is like one bad day or 5 bad years away from being a horror in and of himself.
Yeah. You could
Uh,
so easily picture him being the
Abusive
person.
and all sorts
Yeah.
of horrible things. He hasn't done it yet.
Yeah.
Um, he does die in the end, and I feel like Jess, if she lives,
Mm-hmm.
if she lives past the end credits, which it's kept
You don't know.
vague whether or
Yeah.
not she does. If she lives past the end credits, I feel like she's going to have to do some processing of the fact that she killed probably an innocent man. Um,
Yes. I think though I like that it's a film that's almost like steeped in cultural misogyny, and
mhm.
there is the killer who's doing these things, but there's also so many kind of what we might call like microaggressions or moments of like
Yes.
small acts of small violence, like him saying she tells him she's pregnant and he was like, okay, we're gonna get married, and she's like, no, I have a life, I have
Mm.
dreams, I don't want to do this. And he increasingly kind of pressures her to do that. And that's such a, obviously he's not trying to kill her, but he's trying to sort of make, he's trying to stake a claim on her body in a way that's more, I think, insidiously violent. Um, and the police as well, when they go to report Claire missing, he says the policeman at the front desk says, "Oh, she's probably just shacked up with a boy or whatever,"
Mhm.
and they refuse to kind of take it seriously at that point.
Well,
Which
it's a
again is
story of
something,
agency, of validity, and the way
yeah.
that women aren't listened to unless a man speaks for them.
Yes, because the boyfriend intervenes. I think he's
Mm-hmm.
friends with the detective and he
Mm-hmm.
comes to the police station, and it's at that point that it's taken seriously. And
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, and also I think just the father as well, Claire's father coming to the police station, just his presence seems to validate it as something that's worthy of being like investigated. The way that they treat the female characters, um I think is very interesting. So it's almost, I think we might say it's like an escalating series of acts of violence against these women. There are obviously the murders in the house, but so many kind of smaller things that color their experiences in the world, and that make it easier for him to do this, make it more likely that this will happen. I think that line, the call, the famous line, the calls are coming from inside the house,
Did
which is
not realize that
interesting.
that's where that came
Yeah,
from.
my boyfriend, well, my fiance now, didn't realize that either. He was joking throughout that they were going to say that line, and I was like, yeah, no, that's where that comes from.
That's where it came
Um,
from.
but let's like honestly, let's look at that as like a metaphorical statement on, the violence is inside the house.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just this guy. It's all around them. They're swimming in it. That's one of the reasons I love this film so much.
I will tell you that the red eye at the end
Mm-hmm.
unsettled me.
Scary, yes.
I didn't, I was not, I appreciated that even though it is the mother of slashers,
Mm-hmm.
it's not a violent film in that
Yes.
there is not a bunch of gratuitous corn syrup being thrown
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. Very much unlike our next movie on the list, which was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is sort of the birth of that buckets of blood kind of thing.
Yes, I think for some reason, I think when people forget about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, if they haven't seen it in a while, they expect the body count to be higher. The body count
Mm-hmm.
in that movie is quite low.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I what I love about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which came out the same year as Black Christmas, is that it's got this apocalyptic vibe. You feel like maybe this is a Texas thing, I don't know, but you just feel like this could be the last place on Earth. There's such a sense of
Yep,
hopelessness.
that's Texas.
Yeah, but it's just so um I can't even explain how it unsettles me on a really
I
profound level.
can't either, Dr. Eva Burke. I can't explain how Texas unsettles me either, but
It's
I
just
could
so
try.
apocalyptic. It's so apocalyptic. Um yeah, I I'm a huge fan of this film. It's very different to Black Christmas. I'm a huge fan of it for that reason because it has this sense of doom. It's just kind of imbued with doom.
Mhm.
And there are all these references at the beginning to kind of fate and like star signs and horoscopes, which I find really, really interesting. It's almost like a Scooby Doo episode gone wrong, which I really like. It's a van full of teenagers trespassing where they don't belong, and then terrible things happen to them. Um, but no, I think it's phenomenal. I also just visually, I think there are so many images and stills you could take from that
Mhm.
movie that are like art in themselves. Like it's just, it's a really low budget, really terrifying film.
The rest of the 70s and 80s really show you that kind of young teenage, lots of body, lots of blood, lots of everything. You've got your Freddy Kruegers,
Yeah,
you got your
Jason.
Halloweens, you got
Yeah.
your lots of girls in skimpy bikinis out by a lake somewhere, and there's a killer, and sometimes they're given a backstory and sometimes they aren't. A
Hmm.
lot of those don't appear on the list. So just that era of horror slasher whatever, what do you think the conversation is there? What's happening with those movies as horror evolves?
Yeah, I think I'm not. So the reason I chose these two movies from the 1970s is because I think that they're almost exceptions to the rule.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't choose Halloween just because I assume you've already seen it. I'm a big fan of Halloween, as well. But I think in the 1970s, what we see in a lot of these films are anxieties about female bodies, female autonomy, the kind of changing role of women. I'm sure you're familiar with this trope of the final girl,
Yeah,
that comes from a lot
which
of these
which then
films.
became a movie called Final Girls.
Yeah. But the idea is that often that she is, um, her friends might be more sexually active, or they might be doing things that are, the parents might disapprove of, but the final girl is generally quite pure. Um,
Final Girl is pure. She typically has a gender neutral name. She
yes.
typically there's all of these tropes, and
Yeah.
I hate that I know so much about it because Joss Whedon talked about it so extensively because he wanted Buffy to be
Mhm.
sort of the final girl flipped on its head.
Yeah.
That's sort of
But I mean,
where Final Girl as badass karate chopping hero sort of
mhm.
began.
I think, I mean, obviously, as well as we said earlier, it's okay, I think, to look at someone like Joss Whedon's work and to talk about his work and things that he's written, um,
Well,
and
he
try
was a
to
very
think,
I mean, it influenced a
yeah,
generation of
and try to
conservatives.
separate what we think of him
Yes.
from it as much as
He's
we
a
can.
bad person.
Yeah,
He's a bad
um,
person and
objectively
just
a terrible person, but
yes, objectively a bad
um,
person. His work
yeah,
has influenced many genres.
yes, and we can't. There's no point denying that. It would be foolish to deny that. Yeah, so the final girl kind of emerges in this period, and as you said, she's usually pure. Um, and she goes through a lot, but she tends to survive until the end. So that's a huge trope. It's not one that I might just be jaded because I watched a lot of horror movies. It's not one that I prefer or enjoy watching now. A fantastic film actually from, I think it's from the mid 2010s, called You're Next. I think it's 2013, 2014. Really does a great job of deconstructing the final girl. So the main character is at her boyfriend's, family's house for the weekend, and they're attacked by mysterious slashers. But it turns out she was raised by a survivalist father, and she's got insane skills, and she starts killing the killers. And it's really, really good. It just really deconstructs that idea of the final girl as, um, just a woman doing her best to survive. Like this girl's a badass. She's hunting them by the end, it's brilliant. Um so yeah, no, in the 70s you see a lot of this, anxiety about women and, women in homes and younger women especially, like experimenting with drugs and experimenting with sexuality. Um and I think that's partly where the final girl comes from.
The next movie on the list is The Fly.
You hated it.
I um I went to look at the reviews for this
Hmm.
movie, like the Rotten Tomatoes and all of that,
Hmm.
fully expecting it, like many horror movies, to have like a somewhere between like a 40 to 60%
Yeah.
critic score and then like a 90% audience score. That
Hmm.
typically is like oh, that's probably a good horror movie when it's like
Yeah.
critics hated it, audiences love it, it's probably great kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, it is universally beloved by
Yeah.
critics and audiences.
Yeah.
So clearly there's something wrong with me because I saw no redeeming value in this movie whatsoever from any standpoint at
Okay.
all. I hated this movie. Could you tell me, as a doctor, what's wrong with me that I hated this movie so much?
That's a
I
longer conversation.
I thought it was boring. I thought none of the decisions make any kind of sense. Gina Davis is I why would what Gina Davis, honey, like she
Yeah.
had no character. There was no that woman had no personality except to like heave at Jeff Goldblum. Like she was there to let you know that Jeff Goldblum was a sex god or something. Like that was her entire function in the movie. She has no personality. And I could not believe for the life of me that all of the reviews are just like, "Oh my god, the characters in this movie. Oh, this is just such strong character development." I'm like, "Whomst? Where? How?" Gina Davis has no character. She is boobs and lips. That is her entire character in this movie.
Okay. Okay. I think
I
some
hated
of
it.
the critical acclaim that you're talking about here might be linked to the fact that David Cronenberg is kind of considered an auteur of horror. So he's considered, yeah, but he's considered somebody who's very important in the genre, somebody whose work is very important. And I think there might be a broader conversation here about um, certain filmmakers and their output um, being critically beloved, even if certain people don't like it. I am a fan of it because I'm a fan of body horror. I really like to see. I'm interested in seeing the kind of physical degradation of the character, the way that he physically changes. I also think the effects are really good, which
For
is something that I
1986,
don't
yeah,
usually know.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't usually notice that, but I think the effects are really good. Um, I think also I was thinking about it. I noticed that this and Black Christmas both have abortion subplots, where the female character wants to abort a pregnancy or end a pregnancy, and the main character doesn't. They're dealt with very differently.
Yes.
Mhm. Um, the scene where Gina Davis gives birth to the maggot thing, I think, is just fantastically horrifying.
I laughed. Is that supposed to be scary?
Well, okay, let's just pause for a second here. I think that sometimes horror can make you laugh, and that's okay. I think that someone like Jordan Peele, for example, one of the reasons he understands horror and good horror is because he comes from a comedic background,
Mm-hmm.
um, and there's almost value, I think, in the absurdity of some horror.
Yeah, oh,
Like I know
sure,
a lot of
sure.
people find Ari Aster's work like funny to watch because it's just so outrageous, and
Yeah,
you're like, what am I seeing? What is this? I think that can be good. I think that horror
sure.
can be funny, and just because it makes you laugh doesn't mean it's not scary. It doesn't mean that it's not a horror
Yeah,
movie. Um, I respect your opinion on the fly,
I
though.
just didn't nothing about anyone's decisions in this
Mhm.
movie made any sense whatsoever. And I mostly Gina Davis. I just thought if
Mhm.
I I I think I was live tweeting it, and I think I got about 90 seconds into this movie and I was like, "Oh, a man wrote this. Not just a man, a white man. A cisgender heterosexual white man wrote this movie." And I was like, "Oh, three heterosexual cisgender white men wrote this movie." I was like, there was not a woman involved in this movie in the
I mean
creation
that
of Gina Davis's
you'll notice
character.
that with a lot of 80s horror, though. A lot of
Yes,
90s horror, yeah, it's very
I
um
would. I think the movie could be done well. I would engage
mhm,
with the body horror of it. I would love to see a woman, because this is not Cronenberg's story. This is based
mhm,
on a short story.
yeah.
Um, and I read the short story. I went back and read the short story because I was like, surely the source material has to be better. And it was. The source material is much better.
Mhm,
It's much better. It's so much more interesting, and there's a horrible choice made at the end that I just
yeah.
didn't feel was conveyed on the screen. But uh, I would love a woman to write The Fly.
I think there is an argument to be made that we can go back to. I enjoy The Fly. I think The Fly is a good film, so we disagree on that. But I think that just because it is, we might say it's okay. I'm gonna use an example here,
Mhm.
a slightly different example of films from the 1970s, a subgenre called rape revenge movies, and these are films like I Spit on Your Grave, The Last House
Yes.
on the Left,
Hmm.
famously very exploitative, but has been some feminist
Hmm.
or revisionist criticism of these films. Like they've been redeemed almost, or they've been looked back on with some with a feminist lens, and they
Hmm.
find value in that. And I think that that could be something that you might do with The Fly, or with some of those films that are very kind of male gaze centric.
Hmm.
That you might find. I'm not saying that you have to, or that there are things that you might find more enjoyable on a second watch. But I think even a film that is um, we might say it's definitely not a feminist film. I still think we can go back and find value
Okay, maybe I'll
in
go
things like that.
watch. Maybe I'll go watch I Spit on Your Grave, and then I'll go back and rewatch The
Oh
Fly
God.
and see if it influences.
I mean, I find that subgenre very distasteful. I don't enjoy the exploitation of it, but I still think that there is value in the story of a woman who has been assaulted in some way. In her kind of finding, it's very cathartic, I suppose, to watch her kill the men who did that to her. There's one that's lesser known. It's called Miss 45. I think I'm getting the title correct, but she is sexually assaulted and then begins to kill men with a gun, kill sexually violent men, and it's just so fun because they so deserve it, and it's
I
very
did think it
cathartic.
was so interesting how little. So there's a period of time in the 90s and early 2000s where horror there wasn't a lot of love for horror, and also even people that like
Mhm.
horror don't really have a lot of favorites from that time
Yeah.
period. um and I did there were a few notable exceptions, and I think they tended to all be based on the fact that like Japanese horror was
Yeah.
becoming very, very, very big, and
Hmm.
influencing worldwide uh horror filmmaking. The Ring, The Grudge, a lot of other movies that starts with the
Hmm.
Blair Witch Project was also a notable
Yeah.
uh
That's
film
kind of an
as
anomaly. Yeah.
it was a weird anomaly. Of course, then
Mhm.
from the Blair Witch found footage that became
Yes,
a
but
whole
I mean,
genre of found footage horror things.
go back though to Cannibal Holocaust, which I think was the 70s or the 80s, was one of the first found footage movies.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yes,
I
a
see. I
very
don't know a lot about the
horrifying.
entire genre.
Yeah, it's a very horrifying movie. And it's a good film. I will say that the animal
Oh,
deaths.
you mean the movie called Cannibal Holocaust is horrifying?
It's yeah, it's more horrifying than advertised. The animal deaths on screen are real, which
No, nope,
yeah, which is very
nope,
upsetting. But
nope, never, nope.
you can get a version of the film with those parts taken out, if you prefer. But that will be the first or one of the first found footage movies. But yeah, no, when you were talking about that kind of late 90s waning, I was thinking of Japanese and Korean horror as
Hmm.
because there are so many good examples from that time period, like The Ring, The Grudge, Audition, One Missed Call. There are so many great films. I think we tend to be when we talk about horror. I suppose we as Westerners tend to think of Western horror first, um, or we think of like maybe horror from Singapore or Korea or Japan as kind of as an afterthought or as something that we um, it just doesn't occur to us to sort of culturally engage with it. But I have never failed to be scared and entertained um, by a Korean or Japanese or Singaporean horror movie. They're they tend to be masterpieces in my experience.
It,
Huge fan of
all of the
Grudge.
ones that I've seen have
Mhm.
the correct mix of dread, of understanding that that thinking there's a thing in the shadows tends to be more terrifying than whatever the hell the thing in the shadows
You
is.
don't need to see too much.
We don't
It's
need to see too
yeah,
much.
yeah. I think Stephen King sometimes falls afoul of that line. He shows us a lot sometimes. Um,
Yeah, the entire, what
a
is
lot,
it,
yeah.
Children of the Corn? It's all
Yeah.
dreadful and terrifying, and then oh, it's a monster
Yeah, we
in the
don't need to
corn.
see. I don't need to see
Yeah.
the monster.
The
Yeah,
clown is actually a spider alien thing
yeah.
in
It's
it.
Yeah, it's not. I think I prefer the sort of gradual build up of dread and then the suggestion of horror. And I think that's one of the reasons Black Christmas works so well is that we don't really ever get to see him full on. We see his eye,
Yes.
we hear his voice, and we see very brief glimpses of him running around. And also the phone calls in that film are genuinely, I think, genuinely terrifying. Like they're
Yes.
really,
I
really
don't know what I
scary.
would do if I was getting those kinds of phone calls.
I would, I honestly, that was one of the first things I said when I watched this movie for the first time. I wouldn't stay in the house. I would be gone. I just
Oh,
the thought of someone like that.
when the
Yeah,
cop tells Jess, I want you to hang up and I want you to leave the
leave
house,
the
ask
house.
no questions, just
Yeah,
leave the house. And she doesn't do it. And then he's like, listen, the killer is in the house. You need to walk out. The front door is right
I
there.
know. I would be gone.
I would have been so gone that Jonah, absolute. Of course, then I can hear people, screaming
I mean,
in their minivan at the speakers and being like, "Yeah, well, you're a white guy. Of course you'd be gone." And be like, "Yeah,
but
well,
like, I love my friends, but I don't want to die.
no, you know what? I'll go outside. I'll go around to their window and I'll throw
Yeah,
some
I'll
rocks
throw
at the
it up
window
at
and
the
be like,
window.
"Hey, are you
Yeah,
dead?" And if they don't
yeah,
answer, I'll be like, "I guess they're dead."
yeah.
So,
Yeah. I think, yeah, I think we would survive a slasher movie because our
oh,
survival is
I would not
better.
go in the basement.
No,
Absolutely not. I would not go
no,
in the
never.
basement. I'm not going to go in the dark, creepy woods where the kill. Oh, they say a killer hangs out in the woods on a full moon night.
Okay,
Well, you know what? It's a full
good
moon, and
luck.
there's those woods. Not going in
Good for
there.
him. Yeah, I'm not going in there.
Have
No,
fun.
there's
Have
a
fun,
really,
Choppy McGee.
really terrible film from a few years ago called Slender Man that's based on the Slender Man myth, and it's absolutely dreadful. But the worst part is there's a scene where they go into the woods and they wear blindfolds because you can't look at him. And if you see him, he'll haunt you or something.
Uh-huh.
And they're there with blindfolds, and within 2 seconds, one of the girls pulls off the blindfold and starts looking around. And I was in the cinema, and I was like, I can't, I have to leave. This is the
Yeah.
stupidest shit I've ever fucking seen.
Yeah.
Who?
Anytime I'm watching one of these movies and people are immediately stupid, I'm just
Why?
nope.
Yeah, it's why I don't like The Strangers. I don't feel sorry for them. I'm sorry, but you're stupid. Get out.
Get out of that house.
Get out.
Get out of
Yeah,
that
get
house.
out. Yeah.
How do you think the conversation around horror? What do you think the conversation around horror is right now? And I mean the conversation. What conversation do you think the horror genre is having with its audience right now? You mentioned Jordan Peele. While you
Mhm.
didn't put any of Jordan Peele's movies on the list, I'm assuming it's because one, everybody knows about them right now. He's sort of the master of horror these
Mhm.
days. Get Out, Us. I haven't seen Nope yet,
No,
not for lack of trying.
so
It
good.
wasn't playing in my area, and by the time it was, I was very busy that weekend, and now it's not. So I'm just waiting on
Mhm.
it to come streaming. I can't wait to watch
So
it.
good.
Um, but what conversation is horror having right now?
I think that Jordan Peele is a good example to bring up. I think he is allowing us to engage with like social issues, um, issues of like violence against black bodies, in his horror. No, I don't want to spoil Nope or say too much about Nope, but I think there's a broader conversation in that film about the nature of spectacle and how we are constantly filming and recording, and wanting to be seen by other people. That needs to be had. I think he's very insightful. And I also love that he is kind of married to the genre and I'm sure has had offers to sort of move away from horror at this point, but is still very committed to it and is obviously a fan of it. Um, Apart from Jordan Peele, like someone like Ari Aster, I think has important things to say about trauma and kind of inherited trauma, the effect that that violence and loss can have on us. Um, Mike Flanagan is another one who's very productive. He's got the Midnight Club now. He did Midnight Mass last year. The Haunting of Hill House, The Haunting of Bly Manor. Um, yeah, he's a
Horror
little
is
bit
seeing
more.
the mini series is really where
Yeah,
horror is kind of being consumed
it's
right now.
flourishing.
Another one just came
Yeah,
out on Netflix.
yeah.
The Watcher
The
or something like
Watcher,
that. Yeah.
yes. And that genuinely is based on a true story, a
Hmm.
really scary true story. Yeah, it's flourishing on streaming services. And there does seem to be a kind of preoccupation in things like The Watcher and in Hill House and Bly Manor, again with kind of domestic horror, um, stories of like entrapment, feelings of being watched, which I think probably resonates with a lot of us these days. That seems to be a preoccupation. There is a larger conversation happening with like respectability and horror, whether horror is something that deserves to be acknowledged or should be acknowledged um, as something with cultural value. Obviously, I think that it does. I'm not sure that it will happen because there is this stigma and sort of um, sense that horror is kind of your embarrassing cousin, that you might enjoy spending time with them and they might be entertaining, but you wouldn't bring them to like a dinner party, or you wouldn't really necessarily talk about knowing them. um
It's so
but
interesting how the people that seem to really love horror, women,
mhm,
queer folks, people of color,
yeah.
the folks who are, or at least, I don't know, maybe my social media feed is just very strange, but it seems like those are the people that just seem really diehard supportive of horror.
Yeah.
Um, are also sort of really diehard supporters of things like romance, specifically like
Mhm.
very raunchy romance,
Yeah.
and how like with the advent of e-readers and audiobooks and stuff, how you don't have to be seen reading the book,
Hmm.
that really shot the genre up into the stratosphere of consumption.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting how it, you're making these things click for me, of how these things really are seen as guilty pleasures by the people
Hmm.
who consume them. They're the things that it's okay for me to consume in the privacy
Hmm.
of my home, and that way you don't have to think I'm a weirdo for consuming this
Yes.
nasty, trashy, raunchy, sexy, bloody thing.
But exactly, it's, you know, that people will not think less of you, but that they might think differently of you, or that they might think, well, maybe you should be reading like Ulysses, or, Jonathan
You.
Franzen or whatever. Um, I hate Ulysses. Yeah, no, I think there is a link between um, the kind of guilt you're talking about. It kind of crosses genres, and especially horror. Horror, especially, I think, appeals to people who are outsiders in any sense, um, because it's generally it allows us to explore vulnerability in very specific ways, and also I think horror, even if we think about kind of the bad guys of horror, like the Cenobites in Hellraiser, I think are kind of famously interesting for people who are um
Okay, so I've seen Hellraiser.
mm-hmm.
I don't think I understood that movie. I think I'm not smart enough to understand that movie. I've seen it once. I've seen it one entire time. If I'm
Mm-hmm.
remembering correctly, the pinhead people, they don't even really show up until like the last couple of
Yeah, no,
minutes.
it's been a while since I've seen the original Hellraiser. Yeah, I don't think so. The puzzle box is there, and
Yeah.
the
And the house is doing lots of weird
yeah, and
things.
the human bad guys are doing bad things.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
yeah.
was so confused. I was like, I thought there was this whole like otherworldly demonic
No,
sex
I think
thing
that's the
going on. And
later.
I'm
It's the
like,
later films.
oh, okay. Because
Yeah.
I saw the first one and I was like, I don't think I understood this. And I don't understand why Pinhead is so iconic. And then that was just it for me. It
Yeah.
was like the Pazuzu in, isn't that The Exorcist? Is
Oh
that
yes, he's the
Pazuzu?
demon in The Exorcist. Yes.
Yeah, and I was like, I don't understand why we're talking about Pazuzu so much, because it doesn't really mean anything in the
I have not
context of
seen
this movie.
I've not seen any of the sequels to The Exorcist.
But that's the thing, is I
Um,
think it's elaborated on in all of the
yeah, it
sequels.
might just be a
But I
mythology
that's
thing.
the whole I think the worst thing to do in any horror is expound on the horror
Yeah,
itself.
we don't need expansion. It's
Yeah.
enough to just have this one single
It's like the
horrifying.
Babadook. I
Yeah,
don't
it was a contained story. We don't need
Yes.
more.
Yeah,
You know,
I don't need more.
um, it just cheapens it and thins it and makes it less scary when we know
Yeah.
more. The more we know, it's the rule with anything. I think the more you know about something, the less scary it becomes. Um, like I heard about Charles Manson when I was like 14 or 15, and it scared me so much that I decided to do a school project on Charles Manson. And by the end of it, I wasn't scared anymore.
Okay, I'm very glad that you brought that up. That very specific argument of
Mm,
empathizing with real world killers, because we are
mm,
also right now having a very strange conversation around Jeffrey Dahmer because Evan
yeah,
Peters is so sexy. Um,
yeah.
and yeah, what do you think? Why do you think horror works as a way to explore fear? But yet when we it's interesting how we keep talking about don't give the killer a backstory, but yet when we do things like Dahmer, like what's happening
Mm-hmm.
with the
Yeah.
Evan Petersification of Jeffrey Dahmer and the sexualization of Jeffrey Dahmer and how people are like, I'd let Jeffrey Dahmer kill me.
Yeah, it's so upsetting. It's so upsetting.
So what's happening there that's so different, and what is that? What how do you critically engage with those two different things? Like what's the difference there? Why do you think one works and one doesn't? And is there something problematic about the latter?
Um, yeah, so I think with true crime narratives, there could be a couple of reasons. I think one is that we know what really happened, and often it's in living memory, and there are living like survivors or family members, and it helps us to humanize the killer in a way because it makes it less. It just makes it. You might think, okay, well, this happened to him, and that's why he is the way he is, or Ted Bundy rescued a girl from drowning, so maybe he wasn't all bad. It just makes it less. It just makes it, I think, less existentially terrifying to think of these people as human. But there's also a huge bias towards kind of white male serial killers and people like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy who are considered attractive.
Especially
Um,
when you have people like Zac Efron and Evan
yeah,
Peters
exactly.
and
They are attractive.
Ross,
They
whatever
are
his name is, and yeah,
objectively attractive people. Like,
yeah.
so it's problematic to have them play um, these characters. Often as well, they're kind of sympathetic portrayals, or at least very much centered on the killer rather than on the victims. I know that the Dahmer TV show was heavily criticized by some of the family members of the victims. I haven't watched it, and I probably won't watch it.
Oh, I won't.
Um, yeah, I don't. But as
I've
well, I
seen
think
enough from TikTok of the Evan
yeah,
Peters sexy workout scene, which
it's
seems to have,
upsetting.
yeah.
But I mean, it's so we can't ignore the fact that this is about a story about a white man killing black people and how so many of the
And
TikTok
eating
reviews
them.
and literally consuming them. But like so many of the TikTok reviews are white women who say, "Oh, it wasn't that bad," or "I
Listen,
wasn't
I want to call
disturbed
out my
by
own
it."
people, and white gays are just so thirsty for Evan Peters' mostly naked body. And I'm just like, folks,
Just
that this is a real person who did real and terrible things.
in
And I
very
feel
recent
like,
memory, like there are family members who
yes.
are alive. Like I don't understand.
And I think it's so interesting how there's two different kinds of conversations that can be had there, because when you're talking about a Leatherface, a Michael Myers, or something like that, the only time it leans into the problematic is when you try to give a reason for it,
Mhm,
and it feels like the filmmaker always tries to say, well, this reason is a universal reason. Well, of course, if you grew up in a home where your mom was a stripper, you would kill people. Of course, if you grew up with mental illness, you would kill people. Of course, if you
mhm,
grew up with a deformity, you would kill people. Jeffrey Dahmer, all of these other BTK, even the fascination with folks like the Zodiac Killer. You
mhm.
find the reason. The Zodiac Killer, that very famous, was it movie miniseries, something like that, a few years ago, that tried to say it was mental illness, and he was
Yeah,
this kind of genius. I think there was, weren't they trying to hint that he was autistic or something like that?
yeah. That's a huge thing with the Zodiac killer. The
Yeah.
conversation around him. I think so. There's a really good book by a man called David Schmid, who works at the University of Buffalo about serial killers as kind of America's celebrities or American
Hmm.
celebrities. But there is this huge, this thing that happens with especially male white serial killers, that they become. We project so much onto them, and we feel this need to understand them, um, because they scare us, but also people are people are almost attracted to this idea of kind of godlike figures who exercise control and execute people at will. And it's a very different conversation to the conversations that you'll find around female serial killers or female killers in general. We, for some reason, violent male agency is often celebrated in ways that violent female agency is not. So you never really see, or you very rarely see. I think Aileen Wuornos is one of the only ones I can think of. A cinematic depiction of a female serial killer, and there's a very big difference in the way that they are portrayed and the tone. I think Mindhunter did a good job in the first season of
Hmm.
depicting these people. The second season veered a little close to um, a kind of not a celebration, but a kind of framing these people as celebrities that I was a bit uncomfortable with. But generally, I think that was quite a good portrayal um of these people. But to be honest, I would like to see true crime move more towards the victim. I know it's natural for
Oh,
us
for
to feel
sure.
it's natural for us to feel intrigued or interested by people who do terrible things because they're an anomaly. Like they're doing things that are unthinkable, and that's interesting. But I would like to see the genre move more towards like a focus on the people who are like left behind, or people who have survived, or people who didn't survive, and we talk about their lives and we celebrate their lives, and acknowledge that they had potential and that they were people, and that just because this person chose to do a terrible thing to them, that doesn't define who they are, who they were, who they could have been. Um, so I would like that to be the direction that it goes in. There is a fantastic TikTok creator. I cannot remember her name now, but her mom was the victim of a crime that is currently the subject of a TV show. It's called The Thing About Pam, with Renee
Yeah, with
Zellweger.
Renee
Yeah.
Zellweger.
Yes, and this girl, I think, very eloquently talks about the experience of this happening and now her trauma being exploited for a TV show. That's kind of like a dark comedy almost, and how uncomfortable she is with that story being retold in such a way. And I think it's really interesting. That really made me think about my own relationship with true crime and um, the responsibility we have maybe um, to think about these things from the perspective of the person who's victimized. To do that thing that we do with slasher movies, to think of yourself in that position.
It's so
So maybe that's
interesting
what needs to
how
happen.
when you compare these two, the fictional horror, the story
Mm-hmm.
is typically about the victims. It's from the victim's
Yeah.
perspective. It's women and racial
Mm-hmm.
minorities, queer folks, as the victims, but also as the protagonists, as the
Mm-hmm.
heroes sometimes. Um, and when it's done well,
Mm-hmm.
the evil is the embodiment of evil. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and when you start asking why is when you get into problematic territory. But when you get into true crime, the fascination is on, well, something must have happened to them to make them do
Yes,
this. And
we are
it's the
so
camera is now not on the victim, the camera is now on
the
the
perpetrator.
killer.
Yeah,
Exactly.
but
And
we can't make
there's a
enough.
humanization. You would almost be like, well, I guess if all those things happened to me, I'd probably want to kill somebody too. And it's like, which, because you've probably also had terrible things happen in life, and we're not all
Yeah,
serial killers. So,
but as well, we really flatten out the nuance when we talk about these things, and like it's hard to find the nuance in a story like Jeffrey Dahmer's or Ted
mhm.
Bundy's. But we as well, I think, just we are culturally prepped always to make excuses for certain types of people. Like Ted Bundy was, um, a successful white man, um, semi-attractive, some people might say. So we're primed to say, he didn't really mean it, or maybe this happened, to make apologies for him.
It's like, oopsie.
Yeah, he did it by accident a few times. But I think we're just culturally primed to make excuses for bad men in some ways, unfortunately. I think we make excuses for bad women in other ways. So I'm kind of interested in the idea that female killers, especially female killers who kill in a pair, like Myra Hindley or Rose West or Carla Homolka, that we like to think of them as victims, or we'll say, okay, she was pushed to do this. It was really, he was the brains of the whole operation. And I think that's wrong as well, because violent female agency is something that we should acknowledge. Um, Women can be bad too, essentially.
Country music is
Mm-hmm.
rife with stories of
Mm-hmm.
violent women, but mostly they're revenge fantasies, and you tend to root for
Yes.
them. The Dixie Chicks did a great one. Goodbye Earl is a good one.
Even Taylor Swift has
Yeah,
one.
I was just about to say Taylor Swift
Yes.
just did one with Haim, and
Yes.
there's a ton of them. I think Reba McEntire did one, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But they're always great. They're always great. I feel like at some point I get to return the favor, and I get to give you my version of Halloween movies, because my
Yes, I
version of
would
Halloween,
love
my Halloween is typically very fluffy and very soft
that.
with
Okay.
lots of very sparkly special effects. I will have to come up with something like Halloween Town and Hocus
I
Pocus.
love
And
Halloween now.
oh yeah, well there's only three movies.
They're such good movies.
It's so sad because there's only three, and some folks on the internet are like, no, 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 there's four movies. I'm like,
No,
bestie, sorry, there's only three. No, no,
no.
no.
Um, Yeah, it made me sad recently that there was a lot of fuss about the Hocus Pocus sequel, which I haven't seen yet, and I will watch it. But I just feel like Halloween Town deserves the same attention because it's such a good
Oh,
franchise.
in this house, they are equal footing. In fact, I probably love Halloween Town as a trilogy much more than I love Hocus Pocus. Easily, easily. But I mean,
Yeah,
I also get you get to spend time in a world, and there's the escapism, and the witches are the protagonists, and there's all of that. So
yeah, it's just nice.
and for me, I love that. But I'm gonna have to give you Soft and Squishy at some point.
I
I
would
will.
love that. We're coming into Christmas season, and I love, as much as I love horror, I also love like Hallmark Christmas movies and Netflix Christmas movies. Where there's like a busy businesswoman and she has to go to the Christmas tree farm
Yeah.
in her
Oh,
hometown.
listen, I am an aficionado, and I have to say, Netflix is churning out some good ones.
Oh, they're good. They're good.
Give Vanessa Hudgens, put Vanessa Hudgens in everything.
She
Honestly,
knows
yeah, the
the
Christmas
switch
Switch that was great, but also her the night
the night
the
before
Christmas.
Christmas.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that. Oh, that was
phenomenal.
fun.
Yeah,
How
so
that
good.
didn't get the same sequel, I don't understand. It
There
was supposed
is
to
a
get a
sequel
sequel.
coming. There is a
Oh, is it
sequel coming.
finally?
I think COVID was a factor, but there is a sequel coming either
Because
this
they
year
they teased
or
at the
next
end that
year.
there was supposed to be a sequel, and I was like,
Yeah.
yes, please,
And
absolutely.
we've got a Lindsay Lohan one coming this year, and
I'm
I think it's filmed in
the
Ireland.
gays have been
Where
counting
she
down for a year for that. It's Lindsay Lohan and or Lohan. I guess we've all been saying her name wrong.
Lohan.
And Cord
I think
Overstreet.
In Ireland we would call her Lohan. I think that's the
Yeah.
Irish pronunciation. Yeah, and there's an amnesia subplot. I'm so excited.
She
I
needs to
love.
quit doing amnesia subplot. Wasn't that her whole? Wasn't that the last movie that she did when her career kind of fell apart?
There was
Was
one called I Know Who Killed Me, which I think was I didn't see it. I think they were twins,
No,
and
there
one of them
was
had
one right
amnesia.
before where she was it Just My Luck or something? Didn't she
Oh
like
yeah, I
get
forgot
hit
about
in a
that.
car accident and she loses her memory, and that was
Yeah,
kind of her last big movie,
yeah, it all fell
and
apart
it
after that.
failed so
Yeah,
hard.
that was. I think though, not to speculate too much, but I think that some of her extracurricular activities made
Well, yeah,
studios less inclined
yeah.
to like insure her or hire her. But I'm very
I am
excited to
all
see.
for a Lindsay Lohan renaissance.
Yeah, oh,
I
definitely.
I would love to see her return.
Yeah.
That would be great. Um, I would love that.
Mhm.
Can we briefly talk about reality television? I know that this is
Always.
going long, and this is not at
No,
all about
always.
horror.
There
But
is an
what are you watching?
there is a new season of Love Is Blind coming in 4 days to Netflix.
Wait,
Uh,
what?
yes, the 19th of October is the third season of Love Is Blind, which I'm very, very excited about. I know there's a trailer and everything online.
Okay,
Um,
I saw the sort of after the show, which I found
yeah,
interesting. They didn't really do that for the first season. So the fact
it
that
was
they're doing that,
messy.
like a
Yeah,
whole season of like
yeah,
after the season,
yeah.
for the most recent season of Love Is Blind, and I saw that. That was interesting.
Mhm.
I am very obsessed with the mole. In fact,
I haven't
5 episodes
seen
came out yesterday, and I'm about to go drink some very cheap wine and watch that, and that's the
it.
rest of my day. And then I'm gonna watch Suspiria. Um, but
That's a good thing.
the Mole was a show. I swear to God, I thought it only got one season a million years ago. It had like
Yeah.
5 or 6 seasons.
Ooh, I love when this.
Like a million years. No, no, no. But like it's a revival on Netflix, and they're
Mhm.
rebooting it and all of that. But I thought it was one season years ago with Anderson Cooper as the host, and I thought that was it. No, no, no. He did like 2 seasons of the show, and then there were like three more with different hosts, and I had no idea. I loved that show. Loved the
Yeah,
Mole.
I know the premise. I haven't watched it yet. It is on my Netflix homepage, so I will watch
Oh,
it.
it's so good. It's so good. Hey, folks, we are toying with the idea of maybe Dr. Eva Burke and I doing a little something something on the side. So
Reality show.
if that is something that you would be interested in, let us know on social media.
I would so
Um,
love
if you would like us to collaborate
that.
podcastually. Um, because you're one of my favorite people to talk about trashy pop culture with.
It's just nobody else gets it like you. Like the selling sunset conversations we've had. It's just nobody else
Listen,
gets
there
it.
is so much depth to some of these shows, and I wish
I
people could understand it.
I know.
I know. I
Um,
know.
yeah, no, I'm waiting for Love is Blind. Um, I watched Bling Empire, the third season. I haven't finished it yet.
I
Um,
literally I was watching the last minutes of an episode before I came in here
I
to
haven't
record with
finished
you.
it. I feel really bad for Christine, and I feel like everybody hates Christine, but I don't get it. I don't get it.
Okay, this is one of the shows. Wait, Christine from Sunset or Christine
No, Christine from Bling Empire.
from Bling Empire? Okay,
Yeah.
so that show, I don't know that there are any good people on that show. I think
They're all
everyone
very
knows
good.
exactly what this kind of show is, and I think everybody is trying to be the villain because they know that when it comes to these Netflix shows, the villain is the one that gets the big following.
Well, I mean, Anna is, I think she's like the heiress to a weapons empire.
She
And
is. Oh,
yeah,
she's fascinating. I saw an article
yeah,
about her and like the fact that she's on this show at all. She's
yeah.
had this like late in life, like I think after her father died, and I
Mm.
guess the finally she's alive. She she basically did not exist for like 40 years. Like
Yeah.
her family was incredibly off the map.
It's very
And
murky. It's very, very
it's
murky.
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
everything about Anna intrigues me
She is
because there's a
steeped in
lot
blood.
going on there.
She is steeped in blood.
She
Um,
is.
but yeah, no, that's an interesting one. But I think you're right. I think that the cast is so rich that it's almost
Well, and
like,
the kinds of things that they do as jokes for one, I mean, like their
yeah,
mean-spirited stuff is just, it's just evil. Like it's just
yeah,
evil.
yeah. But no, I'm watching that. I haven't finished that yet. Um, and I am so there was an Amazon Prime show about like horoscope dating or like matching people up with horoscopes that they thought would work
You know what I
together.
love is Indian matchmaking.
Oh, I love it. I love Seema
I love
Auntie.
it. Yes,
Best. Yes.
I love Indian
Just don't know
matchmaking.
nonsense.
I love it. It's so
Mhm.
good. I love everything about it. So many
Mhm.
terrible people on this.
Yeah. No, they're just many of them are irredeemable, but it's so entertaining to watch.
Yeah.
Um,
But
yeah,
I
I
will
love
say
that.
Netflix has some interesting concepts for like
Mhm.
competition reality shows.
Yes.
They come up with some unique things. Now, later seasons, like you and I have talked about, what was that first season of what's the thing with the where they have a fake Alexa and it's
Oh, it's too hot to handle.
yeah, too hot to handle. The first season of that is so interesting.
Yeah. The
That would be
premise
fun.
is because it's like a proper social experiment, and
It
then it's the same with Love is Blind. I think in the
yes,
later seasons, you just get people who want to be famous or
correct.
who are there for
Once
the
the
wrong
cat is
reason.
out of the bag
Yeah.
of what the twist is.
Yeah. I think one season is plenty for these things, and then
Yeah.
move on and do something else.
One season's interesting because
Yeah.
it's then you get people going on for the wrong reasons, which you saw in Love Is Blind season 2 with what's his name?
Yeah.
Shake.
Shake.
He
Yes,
was
and
horrible.
both of the married couples from that season are now divorced or divorcing. So
Wait, but no,
yeah, Nick
no.
and
Danielle
Danielle.
and
They're
no.
separated. Yes, they're separated. I know. I know.
No, okay, so I was not a Nick and Danielle person at all. Not at
Yeah,
all, not in any way,
I
shape,
thought they were
form.
a bad match. Yeah, but
And
no, they
then I saw the recent
were.
season of like after the show, and I was like, oh,
Yeah,
they're great together.
I know. I was so upset. I was more upset by them than the other couple because
Well,
Ayana
they
and
never
Jared
seemed like they were
were.
going to work. The other
He was
couple never
never.
seemed.
Yeah, that was never gonna
That
happen.
was a bad.
But
She gave him way too much leeway. They should have never continued on.
I think stuff happened that we weren't told about between
Yeah.
them.
Yep. 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 Yep.
Which is their business. But
Yep.
yeah, so neither of the married couples from that season have actually stayed together compared to the first season. So yeah,
I need Netflix to hurry up and get on the one couple from the first season. I need them to have a whole show.
Cameron and
Yes.
they were was it Laura or
I don't remember. I just
they were
remember
so
they
good.
like Shonda Rhimes got on there and was like, a mixed race couple that this and this and this, and she was like, yeah, like oh my god, this is everything. Like, could Shonda
Yeah,
Rhimes make a show about them or something? Like, I love them. I
yeah,
need
they were
six
so
seasons of that.
genuine and they were there for like the right reasons, which unfortunately I think the second season cast was just not.
Well,
Um,
again, once you know what the show is going to be, even if
yeah,
you keep
because
the topic of the show a secret when you're applying, once you get there and you realize, oh, I'm on Love is
yeah,
Blind, I know how I need to behave here. Like, I know
because
what
what
will get me
kind of
far.
yeah, because they've seen the show and they know
Right.
who succeeds and who gets the most screen time and attention. But Yeah, so I'm waiting for that, the third season of that. There was a fourth season of The Circle, which was okay. It wasn't great, but the Spice
Yeah.
Girls were on it, which was
Yes, I saw that.
amazing.
I
That
saw
was
that.
amazing.
That was
Um,
fun. It was
yeah.
better than I think either seasons 2 or 3. The first season was good. Maybe the second
Mhm.
season of The Circle was better. I will say I don't think, as far as social experiments go, the first season of The Circle might be Netflix's best.
Mhm.
Because
I
again, once people knew what The Circle was,
Yeah, because then it becomes about strategy and like,
correct. Like, oh, this
and
is
that's
what I
not
need
what
to
it's
do
about.
to strategize and this and this
Yeah,
and this. That first season was a true social experiment of
yeah,
it broke my heart in some episodes. I mean, I
yeah,
legitimately like was emotional
yeah.
about some
But
of
it was
those
really about like
episodes.
building relationships without really knowing
Yeah.
if the person is genuine, and that was really
And the
intriguing.
conversations
Um,
about body and body image
yeah,
and self-love and the way that we present ourselves to the world and
yeah,
then it became a catfish hunt, and that's just
yeah.
as though
That's
being a
fun.
catfish were inherently a bad thing,
Yeah, or
instead of
that
the
you were trying
conversations
to
around
like.
why are people doing that.
Yeah, I have noticed on the circle that there is a strong trend towards attractive women not doing well. Either people women who are genuinely attractive women or women who are catfishing as attractive women, they never do well. But attractive men, either genuine or catfish, usually go quite far on it, which I think is interesting. Um, yeah, it's a good concept for a show. I would like to see like more kind of variations um on the concept.
Of course, I think it would be
Um,
so hard to do. I mean, it's hard to do
yeah,
variations on that
because
concept.
everybody knows what the game
Yeah,
is, and yeah,
yeah,
and it just becomes though it really does become now about like, oh, I don't think this person is really who they say they are, and that's the focus of the show. That's not
right.
what it was at first, and yeah, I
Hmm.
kind of missed that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um.
Dr. Eva Burke, if
Yeah.
people want to talk to you about horror, about their favorite horror movies, about is there anything coming up that you're excited to watch? It is the
Yeah.
season
So
of it's spooky season. And
it's that time
this
of
will come
year.
out on this is only coming out next Tuesday, so people will have a few weeks to get in the spooky
Yeah.
season. Other than the official Head on Fire horror movie list, which
Mhm.
once again is Black Christmas 1974, Texas Chainsaw Massacre also 1974, The Fly from 1986, Candyman 19. By the way, The Fly had a sequel. Did not even know that. Had no
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
Candyman
Mhm.
1992, Audition 1999, like Mungo 2008, and Suspiria 2018. The 7 days of Head on Fire horror, as dictated by Dr. Eva Burke. But Dr. Eva Burke, is there something that you are excited to see that has yet to come out that you haven't seen?
Yeah, so I haven't seen Smile yet, which I've heard good things about. It's supposed to be, some people are telling me that it exceeded their expectations
No,
and that
I've heard also good things. That and Black Phone from earlier this year. I never got to
yes,
see that, and
I
I'm gonna
haven't
see
seen
that
that.
soon.
So I want to see both of those. I'm probably gonna see the newest Halloween film, even though I've heard very mixed things about it. Um, because I'm a completionist and I like to finish a
Sure.
series that I've started. I'm wary because I've heard that it takes a very experimental turn or it does something kind of unexpected. I don't know what that is. So I'm gonna see that. Um, on Halloween itself, I'll probably just watch some good old horror movies. Halloween, the original Halloween. I always like to watch Hocus Pocus, and I will watch Hocus Pocus 2, which I haven't seen yet. But again, I read an article earlier.
I will
I think the
recommend I will recommend to you the correct way to watch Hocus Pocus is to find your fuzziest pajamas,
mm-hmm.
go to the store, buy the cheapest candy. You want to pretend like you just came home from trick or treating and you have it into. Oh wait, y'all don't do trick or treating.
No, we do. Yeah, we do.
Oh, okay, you do. I know because I know
We
that like
import from
Halloween as a
America.
modern thing is very
Yeah,
United
it's very
States.
American,
It's
but
a
yeah,
very
no, we
American
do.
thing.
We've imported trick or treating here
Oh,
in
good. So
yeah.
you want to pretend like you just came home with a pillowcase
Mhm.
full of
And they,
just candy, like
yeah,
not name brand, like just wrapped
yeah,
candy. And you want to sit there, you want to go into a sugar coma, and you want to just consume with your 8-year-old eyes. Like that's the way to watch this movie.
yes. I'm very excited for that.
It is a
But yeah,
love letter to the fans. I will tell you that. There's a lot of love for the people who love the movie. So there's a lot of winks and nods to queer kids. There's a lot of little baby drag queens. There's drag queens all over the movie.
yes, I know there are some of the
Hmm.
RuPaul's Drag Race queens in it. No, I'm very excited for that. So that's probably going to be my Halloween. Um, we usually get trick-or-treaters. In our
I'm
apartment now,
so
our front door is
jealous.
not. Yeah, our front door now is not. It's not street facing, so we don't really get trick-or-treaters in this apartment. But we used to get them in our old place, and it was so fun because you'd get like hundreds of kids throughout the evening, and they're just so sweet and lovely, and just yeah.
I will
Um,
tell you the worst horror thing that I've seen lately is Mr. Harrigan's Phone
oh yes, I heard bad
on
things about
Netflix.
Stephen
Yeah, well,
King's.
I ranted about it on
Yeah.
Twitter, so I wouldn't duck
Yes,
you on
it's
me, but
probably your yeah.
there are some things that should just remain short stories. Like not
Hmm.
every, we don't have to turn Stephen King's grocery lists into full length feature film. I mean, like I feel like there's just like, oh, you slap Stephen King's name on it and people will
Yeah.
watch it. Like I get that,
Hmm.
but maybe not everything he wrote should be
Yeah.
adapted. There was enough meat there for maybe a 40, 30, 45 minute. I mean,
Mm,
for a short story, and
yeah.
they just stretched it out. It was so bad. There just wasn't
But
enough there
there
there,
there are so many other horror authors as well that they could be
right?
adapting, you
Yes.
know. Um, there's James Herbert who wrote The Fog, and a lot of other really good Peter Straub. Like there are so many other horror authors that we could be adapting. So I suppose again it's just going back to the idea of the author as a product and the author as a celebrity and
Mm.
um the name more so than anything else. So if people put Stephen King's whatever, somebody will watch it, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Eva Burke, if people want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Yes, I'm on Twitter. So my Twitter name is EVA underscore B89. Um, and I mostly post cat pictures, but also sad tales of my life and just general observations on the world. I'm on TikTok. I'll put my TikTok link in my Twitter bio. It's genuinely just cat clips again and like clips from TV shows that I've enjoyed. But yeah, Twitter is the best place to get me if you want to talk about horror or terrible reality shows or anything in between those two things.
Well, thank you so much for kicking off spooky season here with me.
Oh, thank
It is
you. This was so
always a
fun.
pleasure to get to speak with you. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. Happy almost Halloween. It's
Happy
spooky.
almost Halloween.
Yes.